Allison, when teaching composition, do you prefer to use nonfiction or fiction, as in short stories, drama, and poetry?
I would prefer to use nonfiction when teaching composition because I feel as if composition nowadays is for across the disciplines and a very small percentage only go into literature. So since we only have that small percentage going into literature and we want to teach composition across the disciplines, it's more practical for most workplaces if we tend to use nonfiction to teach, because that way we have more of a practicality thing going on. Whereas if we use nonfiction, it might not be accessible to most people. I would equate it to teaching imaginary numbers to someone who just wants to learn basic math for everyday life. So again, kind of bringing it back to that more practical purpose behind teaching nonfiction versus fiction in a composition setting.
Because do you see the purpose of composition as helping students to communicate later in their working lives and in their overall life? Is that the purpose of composition?
Absolutely. I think composition and communication at this point in education have intersected with one another. And I feel like that is probably the place for composition. The only time where I feel anything regarding fiction would have a place in the composition classroom is if we were to teach literary criticism and show how to use those various schools of criticism to analyze something, to probably make better presentations, better thought process, better communication between one another. If we're sensitive to use about money, power, class, we would probably want to examine Marxist theories, whereas if we want to analyze something regarding gender roles and LGBT, we might want to read something by maybe somebody more literary to kind of get a better feel for where those roles play in our modern society and to be more sensitive to diversity issues. So that would be the one place where I would want to use fiction.
What about sensitivity to student interests, let's say? Do you think it possible that students might be more engaged in some cases by drama, short stories, poetry, than they would be by historical artifacts or editorials or whatever other nonfiction one might normally use in a course on composition?
I would still say to be very careful with any kind of literary jargon. That could get in the way when it comes to meaning. It's very different to use literary devices to analyze something, and that could end up hindering the students more than helping. But as far as an interest and engagement is concerned, I would use more current events, maybe something happening in technology on the internet, maybe take an article off a gaming website or gaming commentary and kind of show something that's a little more accessible to students. There's ways to show accessibility without using fiction. Maybe at the end of the semester, after the students have a very good grasp on composition, maybe then you might be able to work in fiction, but again, you don't want to alienate those who might not be interested in learning and analyzing literature. I feel like at that point you would need to branch composition off into multiple classes. So for example, at Penn State we had English 202 A, B, C, and D, and that was composition for what specific major you are. But as far as an entry-level course is concerned, keeping as much fiction out of the courses as possible would probably be the angle I would take. That doesn't mean to say that you can't use a different device for composition. For example, the theme behind my individual composition course when I taught comp at St. Bonaventure was semiotics, a series of signs and symbols, and how we can read those signs and symbols to better communicate and understand things around us and to kind of communicate ideas to other people through those semiotics. So if you kind of shaped it around maybe one literary device or even one literary term like that, you might be able to do that, but again, you want to keep it as simple as possible in the introductory composition courses.
What about the issue of perhaps helping students to engage with works that are important from a cultural standpoint, whether it be short stories, a play by Shakespeare, poetry by the Romantics, Keats, Wordsworth, Is that important, or do you think students will have the opportunity to encounter literature perhaps earlier in their high school career or later in their college career, so that it's not that important for a composition course?
I believe most colleges nowadays, at least the ones that I have seen, have required at least one literature course. I think we should keep literature confined to the literature classroom and let the students choose what type of literature they would like. Because again, they might confuse the information they learn from, poems, from old literature, and they might not get the lesson that you necessarily want out of that. So again, we're trying to think about those going into STEM fields, which those are certainly going to be saturated. Those even going into business fields, you can't really apply as much some of those raw feelings and emotions that are trying to be communicated in those things. Perhaps if you chose the Shakespearean play properly, for example, Merchant of Venice, I feel would be something that could be very accessible to different kinds of fields and business, and even some of the approaches that is taken in there.
I feel it would be something that could be
Hang
very
on.
acceptable.
Thank you very much, Allison.
Thank you.